her studio and compound is called AZ West, and it's about a 85-acre compound parcel that has her house, multiple experimental living structures, the studio, and a lot of permanently installed sculptures. And so when Elena and I first started working for her, we really started working for her and AZ West and sort of managing the residencies and the different sort of public programs that go on at AZ West. And the more sort of we became involved in the community and all the things that Andrea was doing, we began working more on high desert test sites programming. And now I spend about half my time doing high desert test sites and half my time still running AZ West, and Elena does all high desert test sites programming. So that's kind of like our mini backgrounds and our relationship to how we also got to Joshua Tree, because we moved there to start working with Andrea. High Desert Test Sites is a nonprofit arts organization that both inserts and stewards experimental artworks in the high desert region around Joshua Tree. We engage local and visiting artists and general audiences in intimate exchanges and immersive artworks. HDTS programming includes performance, site-specific installations, workshops, screenings, publications, and residencies. We are best known for a large roving biennial art event where artworks and happenings are sited in diverse locations across the high desert region. And then, like I was saying, but HDTS started in 2002, shortly after Andrea moved out there. So there are many years under its belt before Elena and I got out to the desert. And in those early days, the people who were most involved were Andrea and the other co-founders. And those other co-founders were Lisa Ann Auerbach, Sean Regan, Andy Stillpass, and John Connolly. And Lisa Ann Auerbach is an artist like Andrea. And Lisa Ann is mostly a fiber in knitting and publication zine artist.
And she designed like most of the first publication zines that accompanied the biennial events.
Mm-hmm. And then Sean Regan was and still is Andrea's gallerist in LA. And she was really instrumental in getting the word out about those early HDTS events. Andy Stillpass is a collector who is based in Cincinnati, but I think he was also based part-time in New York for a while. That's how Andrea knew him. And then when at the beginning, they were also trying to kind of source land to site these experimental works on. Andy also helped by purchasing some land parcels that would be used for a lot of these installations. And then John Connolly is a curator that Andrea was working with also. So yeah, so what we first wanted to outline, because it's still such a huge part of our conversation and sort of moving forward with high desert test sites. If some of you don't know, we're trying to kind of slowly make this announcement. It's like Andrea has stepped down as director, and so I'm acting director at the moment, and so Elena and I are really sort of considering a lot for the future of high desert test sites, really without Andrea. And so we're ruminating a lot on a lot of the original tenants. And so these tenants are to challenge traditional conventions of ownership, property, and patronage. Most projects will ultimately belong to no one and are intended to melt back into the landscape as new ones emerge. To insert art directly into a life, a landscape, or a community where it will sink or swim based on set of criteria beyond that of art world institutions and galleries. To encourage art that remains in the context for which it was created, work will be born, live, and die in the same spot. To initiate an organism in its own right, one that is bigger and richer than the vision of any single artist, architect, designer, or curator. To create a center outside of any pre-existing centers, We are inspired by individuals and groups working outside of existing cultural capitals, who are able to make intellectually rigorous and culturally relevant work in whatever location they happen to be in. To find common ground between contemporary art and localized art issues. To contribute to a community in which art can truly make a difference. HDTS exists in a series of communities that edge one of the largest suburban sprawls in the nation. Many of the artists who settle in this area are from larger cities, but want to live in a place where they can shape the development of their own community. For the time being, there is still a feeling in the air that if we join together, we can still pull back the stamp and stucco housing tracts and big box retail centers. Well, maybe. And so these are the original tenants from 2002. And what Elena is going to do is kind of go through a lot of past projects and sort of talk about how those tenants have been successfully sort of addressed in those projects. But then we're also going to talk about kind of how we imagine we have to rethink some.
Yeah, so I guess to give a little more background on our relationship with the museum too, the Nevada Museum of Art acquired the archive of high desert test sites last year from the first 20 years of the organization's history. And we didn't really have much of an archive a year ago that had been compiled in a very deep and fully extensive way. In 2017, we had an archive exhibition that was part of our biennial, and the co-curators, Moshe and Sarah Mohabi, initiated that idea, and our program assistant at the time, Tatiana Vahan, got together at the very beginning of the physical archive. And so, like Vanessa said, I've only worked for high desert test sites for 5 or so years, so I only really knew the projects from before my time by photos and by statements about the projects that the artists had written at the time of the projects. And so this acquisition of the archive was a really exciting impetus for us to reach back out to the hundreds of artists that we've worked with and kind of get to understand their projects a little more deeply. And so I wanted to go through some of these projects and share, I guess, maybe some stories and context that I discovered during working on the archive that, again, go beyond just the photos and help us reflect on the original tenants and what we might want to take and what might need to change going forward. So I have a lot, I'll be as as I can. This is a project from HDTS 1 in 2002 by Joel Otterson. And this was the first event, and the project's called Two Fires California Adventure. And so the gist of the project was that Joel brought all of these ceramic dishes, and he wanted to pit fire them in the ground. And in order to get the pit hot enough, he had to have a fire for many hours. So he pit fired a whole pig for 10 hours. And once the pig was done, the fire was hot enough to put plates in. But the, story that emerged in the archive was the email that I found that Andy Stopass wrote about his experience helping prepare for this. And he had a huge pile of firewood delivered the day before the project. And then the next day he was driving up to the site, and he was basically ambushed by a caravan of people who were angry and saying, "Why are you making a fire? That's dangerous. You can't make a giant fire in the desert." And they talked back and forth. He kind of explained what we were doing, and there was an art project, and then what high desert test sites was. And they sort of came to some understanding and appreciation. And they said, "Oh, well, do you know Garth? This guy Garth has a property called Garth's Boulder Garden, which still exists in Pipes Canyon. And why don't we do it on his property, because he has a lot of deep knowledge and respect for the region, and also he has a giant fire pit." So I like thinking about that because, well, for one, Garth became kind of a figure that popped up a few other times in the history of HDTS, who either critiqued or gave advice about projects, or also used his, offered his property for artists to do projects on. So this is an example, I guess, of trying to find common ground between the desire to create contemporary art and local issues. And this is a project by Jim Drain called Gold Nugget from 2003. And I thought this exemplified really well the tenet to encourage art that remains in the context for which it was created, or will be born, live, and die in the same spot. So this project, for this project, Jim Drain went behind Andrea Zettel's property, which is right up against a big mountain of boulders, and he gathered some small rocks, and then he covered them with gold leaf to look like big gold nuggets, and he scattered them throughout that same landscape where he found the rocks. And Andrea says that over the years, her son, who was a young child at the time, would find them, he would discover the gold nuggets, but just leave them where they were. And by the time I came across this project in 2017, when I heard Andrea and Tatiana talking about it for the HDTS 2017 archive show, they were like, well, it's gone, it's dissolved into landscape, we don't know where any of the gold nuggets went. But then I was just eavesdropping on the other side of the room, and I said, well, what about that gold rock that we used as a doorstop for the bathroom? And we went over there, and Andrea was like, yeah, I think that's one of the gold nuggets. And so that gold nugget, it still ended up living and dying and finding a new life in pretty close to where it was originally conceived. And now that gold nugget is upstairs on view in the HDTS archive exhibition, but all of the other gold nuggets have dissolved into the landscape for those where. This project is one that we heard a lot about over the years from Andrea.
It's one of her favorites.
It's one of her favorite projects, and it's called The Projects. And the photo on the right there, you can see it's a storefront in Yucca Valley. Yucca Valley has a lot of like small family businesses and storefronts that kind of change over a lot. So there was an empty storefront, and Andrea had been working with a lot of local kids to assist in her studio, and a lot of them were tattoo artists and illustrators, and she wanted to hire people from the community and who, weren't necessarily like people who went to art school, I guess, coming in from out of town. And she wanted to understand what kind of things they were into and give them a platform to share their art. So she rented a storefront space for them to organize art shows, like of their tattoo drawings and other work that they did. And she also took them to art openings in LA and kind of tried to engage in this dialogue to, not to educate them about contemporary quote unquote high art, but just to have a dialogue where they each shared what world of art they came from. And she really gave them the agency to run this art space on their own and do whatever they wanted. And that art space was open, I think, throughout the year, but it was also part of the second and third HDTS biennial. And yeah, so I guess we think about this project a lot because of how it really exemplified trying to experiment with inserting art into the daily lives of local artists. And this project, I thought, also was a great example for the tenet of encouraging art that remains in the context it was created. Jack Pearson created many signs for almost every year of the biennial. He's been in it, and he's a photographer and sculptor who shows with the same gallery that Andrea does in LA, but also has property and is part of the community in the high desert. And so for HDTS 4 in 2004, he recreated this sign for the Palms restaurant, which is a dive bar that's pretty much 40 miles out into the middle of nowhere, like an undeveloped area that's just residential and homestead cabins and ruins. And they have a sign right outside of the restaurant that looks exactly like this sign. So he repainted it and put it on the side of the road, like a few hundred feet as you're driving away, as you're driving up to the restaurant. And I don't think most people even know that this is an artwork. It's still there and functions as a sign for this restaurant. And we might feel like the only people who realize that at this point who still know that it's an artwork. And like a couple last year, the sign blew over, and like I heard my landlord and some other people who live out there were like, oh, the home sign fell over. Like they went together and they put it back up. And little did they know they were like conserving artwork. This project really literally exemplifies the dialogue between an urban art environment and the desert community. This is also in the exhibition upstairs, the original payphone. So Mark Classen put these two payphones, one in Joshua Tree on Andrea's property and one at Socrates Sculpture Park, which is a contemporary public sculpture park in New York City. And they were connected to each other so you could pick up and talk to someone who was seeing art in New York. But then there were also payphones. Well, he didn't place payphones in other parts of the country, but he found a way to connect them to existing payphones in other parts of the country. For example, at a laundromat in Nebraska was one of them. So here again, it's really playing with what happens when you create connections between everyday people's lives and an art project. And this project is one of my favorites too. Mary Beth Heffernan. So, well, some background on the community that this project interfaced with. 29 Palms is the town right next to Joshua Tree, and it's home to the largest Marine base in the country. And so most of the population of 29 Palms are somehow related to military community. And so during the Iraq War, Mary Beth Heffernan spent a lot of time in the many tattoo parlors in 29 Palms and took photographs of veterans who were just returning from service, who were getting tattoos to commemorate their friends who didn't make it home. And so she took photos, and beyond just the photos, she really formed relationships with people who were maybe from a different background with different values than she had. Someone who maybe wasn't totally pro-war had, and she has reconnected with us actually in 2017. I think it was like one of the first times we reconnected with her to really understand, or at least I did, to understand what she calls the long half-life of this project, which manifested in that she's been contacted many times over the years by Marines that were in the photos, their families. She was contacted by two mothers whose sons' names appeared on the tattoos, and an Army psychologist who had treated soldiers, academics studying military iconography and social practices, and peace activists. So this became a social project about having dialogue with the military community as an artist. And the actual project was the physical manifestation were these posters, the poster that the little girl is holding, and that's also an exhibition upstairs. And in the original exhibition, she had a huge stack that the museum has acquired as part of the archive of hundreds of posters that were takeaways for people to take. And she sent a lot of the posters to veterans who have contacted her after they found out about this project. And so yeah, to end the examples, I wanted to share a few examples of projects that have happened at ongoing community centers, or places that a variety of members of our community convene frequently. And the community partners. Yeah, they're community partners, but aside from our relationship with them, they're community centers that are important. And so one of them, like I mentioned, is the Palms Restaurant and Bar in Wonder Valley. And in 2017, our curators, Aram and Saurabh, who were guest curators that year, they organized this program called the Palm Talks, and it was a series of a dozen or so people who were local and non-local, artists and non-artists, and they each gave maybe 5-minute long speeches of some sort or performances. And I felt that this was a very interesting and successful program because people were talking about all different things and coming from all different backgrounds, but the structure of the program like really equalized all of them because they all had the same amount of time and they were all just in this desert forest in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by audience. And that's our friend Vanesa Zendejas giving her performance, which did kind of steal the show, where she was talking about all of her friends in the desert and calling them on the phone during the performance. And she had a dress with little paintings of her friends all over it. And the Palms has historically been involved in every HDTS exhibition, more or less.
It's a tradition, basically, that every year there's a social culmination at the Palms, and that everybody camps in their sort of back lot and wakes up and has breakfast together.
Yeah. Yeah, so whether or not there's actual artwork cited there, it's just the kind of gathering point where everyone comes from all the different sites where the artworks happen and comes together to party. And then also in 2017, we invited the artist Steve Fake, who lives in 29 Palms, to do a project, and he ended up partnering with the Glass Outhouse Art Gallery, which is a really miraculous art space in Wonder Valley, run by that woman right there with the green hair. And it's a gallery that has an open submission process, so anyone can have an exhibition there. But there's a 5 or so long year waiting list because so many people want to have shows there. And they also have yard art, lawn art, and lots of just quirky things to look at. And Edie invited a few artists and people to basically do small workshops at their site. And this is a photo of the archive exhibition from HDTS 2017, which pulled a selection of objects from the archive, and many of these objects ended up in the archive that the museum acquired, as well as the exhibition upstairs. And the exhibition upstairs, it should be said, is also just a selection of objects from the archive. There are many more physical objects than digital ephemera. And this exhibition was in the Firehouse at the Copper Mountain Mesa Community Center in Joshua Tree. And this is another community partner and physical site that we've worked with many times over the years. It's a community center that has things like bingo and pancake breakfast once a month. And right next to the community center is this former, I assume, volunteer firehouse that is no longer operational. And as of this fall, we're going to be officially tenants of this firehouse, and it will be like a year-round outpost for us in addition to the swap meet spot that Christian mentioned. And so it's a beautiful big space where we plan to have a number of community programs, local programs, and also use it as an exhibition space for visiting artists in the future. And this is our swap meet spot.
And the Sky Village Swap Meet is also a community partner that we've always worked with, and that we've always had some aspect of the biennial event has occurred at the swap meet also in the past. And I'm not sure if you're going to touch on like Wendy and Amy. Yeah, it was artist swap meet, and usually what we try to have is sort of like a swap meet-esque sort of artist program at the swap meet. So something where there is like bartering or selling of sort of like small objects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one point that we wanted to share about these community spaces, and I guess spaces that we look for in partnering with, is spaces that bring together people where you don't need any prior investment or education about that space or subculture in order to feel like you can get something out of it or feel welcome there. So the swap meet is a really great example of that. Like I'm there almost every Saturday talking to tourists, talking to the other vendors, to longtime locals, to people who moved away and moved back.
It's a perfect
so many different conversations. Yeah, it's a good meeting space. So those are all of the artworks that I'm going to talk about. We have other slides that we'll flip through, but not specifically addressed. But now Vanessa and I want to use the last couple minutes to just go back to the tenants that we read and reflect on where we are now and thinking about them and how they apply to our goals.
Yeah. I guess the big reason that Elena and I have really been revisiting like the tenants in a big way is because our areas, the region in Joshua Tree has changed so much in the last 20 years and in the last 10 years since we've been living there. And it's just, especially now after the pandemic, such a shift that like so many of the specifics in the tenants are just so different. And we have to kind of reevaluate like how they work and like how we can really think about them. So to challenge traditional conventions of ownership, property, and patronage. Most projects will ultimately belong to no one and are intended to melt back into the landscape as new ones emerge. This is even like a really big one to start with. And it's like, yes, we still want to do this, but we realize that like we would do this maybe with a different tone. And that in the past, when it's worked really well, it's worked when it's a small gesture. And like in some of these artworks, they're small and some of them are really big. And sometimes the big ones are the ones where when we look back to, if we did that again, it could potentially be really problematic in sort of how it does challenge sort of these conventions. And maybe a part of what we're thinking about now is like, well, is our aim to challenge or is our aim to question and to have sort of just a smaller like gesture and to
just have a discussion about what are the implications and challenges and value of the ideas of ownership and property and patronage of art and of landscape.
Then to insert art directly into a life, a landscape, or a community where it will sink or swim based on a set of criteria beyond that of art world institutions and galleries. For this one, I think we are asking ourselves to redefine sink or swim and ask if it's about success or failure, or if it's about whether it's relevant or not to a community. And then that's also layered, and I don't necessarily think that the past was about success or failure either, but it's like, how do we use some of this like language to really get at what we're interested in?
Yeah, it's interesting that sink or swim within that tenant, because like the organization name High Desert Test Sites is really trying to get at the fact that we're trying to test and experiment.
Yeah.
And that's not ever about success or failure. It's about just trying something and then analyzing what happened.
And I think like when we hold on to if we hold on to this idea of sink or swim, it's maybe about like, well, do you always sort of know, maybe as an artist or as a programmer going into something, like what the true relevance is really going to be for that community? Or do you go into it with some ambiguity? And is that important? And I think it is important that some of our projects that you go in with some sort of like unknown, opposed to like how it's going to work.
Yeah, it seems like Andrea, I mean, we came into her life in the desert like 12, 15 years into it, and she had learned a lot like from these early experiments. She had learned a lot and kind of developed some guidelines and rules, not rules, but just like advice that she would give to us as programmers and to the artists who were developing their projects about like maybe what are the desert criteria that you need to know as an artist coming in, usually from an urban environment. This one, that always makes me think of this one, which is a project by Hal McFeely in the early 2000s. It's a painting of bush, and it says, "Loot the art, but the oil is mine." And in the catalog, it essentially encouraged people in a like joking, ironic way to shoot the sign. And I don't think he actually thought people would, but this dry lake bed that it was sited on is a big site for people to go shooting into the mountains and off-roading. And apparently within 24 hours, the whole thing had been shot to shreds. So that's like not something that people would necessarily predict, and that they didn't predict happening, but it's a really good lesson for, well, this is a different context where you have to maybe have some detachment from the physical being of your artwork, because it might disappear in some way or another.
To encourage art that remains in the context for which it was created, work will be born, live, and die in the same spot. I think we both really feel like that should still totally be. To initiate an organism that in its own right, one that is bigger and richer than the vision of any single artist, architect, designer, or curator. So over the last few years of sort of like, coming to the decision that Andrea is going to step out, we've reevaluated this statement, and as much as over the years, so many people have been involved with high desert test sites. It's like the co-founders, but also there was a period where, Aurora Kane was managing it, and she did that for several years, and it was, it's been through many sets of hands, but what we really still know at the end of the day is that it was always Andrea's labor of love. And as much as she's always wanted it to be a shared vision, does have to hold on to. It holds on to her very specifically still. And at this point, Elena and I embrace that, but also are trying to kind of restructure how it can work without her. And so ways that we want to sort of like rethink this tenant, or to like incorporate it into our actual organization structure, is like, we're going to start an artist committee. And we never really had that. It was all the projects that kind of happened in a really organic way. And a lot of it was like people who came to Andrea or to one of the co-founders that, I want to do this, like, can I do this there? And they would just say yes for the most part. But today, it doesn't feel like we can do that in the same way, and wouldn't look the same. So one way that we kind of want to move forward with it as like a structural sort of thing is to have an artist committee, artists who live there in Joshua Tree, who can sort of, together with us, determine like what our sort of themes that we should be exploring are, and like what artists we should be looking at, and like what subjects we should be addressing. And to create a center outside of any pre-existing centers. We are inspired by individuals and groups working outside of existing cultural capitals, who are able to make intellectually rigorous and culturally relevant work in whatever location they happen to be in.
Yeah, this one struck me like the clearest as one that is different now than 20 years ago. And just thinking about what is the cultural center and the pre-existing center, what is the cultural capital. If you're familiar at all with Joshua Tree now, you may know that it, in a way, it kind of is a cultural capital now in a way that it really wasn't 20 years ago when I wrote this. So maybe 20 years ago, it kind of felt like you could make, it was sort of like whatever location you happen to be in, it represented that idea. But now it's a very specific loaded place that has a lot of artists and a lot of change us think about maybe what role high desert chestnuts has played in that history.
And for those who are maybe not as familiar with Joshua Tree, like to give that some sort of more background, it's like, you know, when Elena and I first started moving out there, that was when sort of the park numbers, for example, like doubled every year. And that really happened, you know, in tandem with like Instagram and how like all of a sudden the sort of like experience culture exploded. And that affected Joshua Tree in our region in a really, really huge way. And the sort of like, I don't know, desert aesthetic that has become really popular right now is very rooted in part in Joshua Tree.
Yeah, so now like we can't pretend that we're outside of a center of culture or art. We have to work with the context and the change that is ongoing right now.
Yeah. Then to find common ground between contemporary art and localized art issues. This is still super central to our mission, especially now that the urban rural social landscape is changing due to the pandemic, especially. We have more diverse populations moving to rural areas, and many of those people will need to quickly learn the very different set of circumstances that rural populations deal with. And that filters into art also. There's always been a sort of division between art made in rural communities and art made within urban ones. And rural art has generally been simplified or grouped with a certain landscape romanticism, just to simplify it. But the issues that the rural landscape is facing now are becoming more central, more complicated, and more integral to the larger picture. I've been reading the new Reno exhibition catalog from the show that he did at the Guggenheim about the rural. And he does this amazing job at showing you the many international layers to the new rural landscape. To me, the localized art issues all stem from our general issues of water, gentrification, farming, solar energy in general. And all of those things now, they play out in the desert and they play out in the rural. And so this common ground, it looks so different, but to me, it's actually kind of really exciting because there's so much more sort of dialogue and sort of like, I think, newer understanding of like the significance of the rural space right now. And then I think this is the last
the last one.
To contribute to a community in which art can truly make a difference. HDTS exists in a series of communities that edge one of the largest urban sprawls in the nation. Many of the artists who settle in this area are from larger cities but want to live in a place where they can shape the development of their own community. For the time being, there is still a feeling in the air that if we join together, we can still hold back the San Francisco housing tracks and big box retail centers. And
this one made us chuckle, and I heard some of you chuckle too, because like as long as we've lived in the desert, there have been Walmart and Home Depot, and we use them all the time. And so it started to make us think about the idea of what is the monoculture that you're fighting against. And like 20 years ago, it was maybe this idea of suburbanization and like corporate, you know, corporate monoculture. But now it's almost like we're fighting against, not fighting against, but facing the opposite, which is the culture of the commodification of the handmade and the experience, like experience culture. So it's really like flipped now. And yeah, that's just an ongoing conversation that we talk about all the time.
yeah, and the other thing that I really think about when I read the specifics in that tenant is like, oh wow, but my understanding of like sort of like big box and stucco tract homes is like so different now. Like you know, how it was viewed before is just not the same. And it's like, you know, these big box stores and the tract homes, like they serve a very like, you know, socioeconomically diverse population. And like, that's our intention is not to actually like alienate that population at all. And so, and actually also like I've as someone who was like raised in a city and as a teenager was very like anti-suburban monoculture. Now I go to the suburbs and the suburbs are more diverse than a lot of cities. And the suburbs have like huge like immigrant populations and these like, you know, amazing, like, it's totally changed.
Yeah.
And so like when I read this, I feel like, wow, like this is totally different. And like, even when it comes to like Walmart, it's like, you know, we don't shy from going into Walmart, because we need it. And like, who's to say we're better than anybody else who needs to go to Walmart? And there's just a lot that we kind of like, you know, it's like we realize it's like, oh, this is a different picture than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah, and we almost see like that there's more class, economic, and racial alienation and segregation prompted by the cult of the handmade
and the aesthetics of the experience culture. But, yeah. So
that's pretty much the middle of the conversation where we're at. That we keep going on forever, but yeah, hopefully introduced you to where we are right now in this moment of change and transition, and also looking back at some informative projects in the past. Questions?
Elena, Vanessa, thank you very much. We're going to open it up to questions and try to be mindful of the raise lunch hour as well. I'm so glad that you kind of ended with that 7th tenant, because that was not certainly that I was speaking about seriously. Beginning with that tenant came up, thinking about the shifting landscape. And I'm going to do one thing really quickly, which is move this so our whole so I guess one of the questions that I was thinking about as you were talking was about place and even thinking, especially in that 7th tenant, I believe it's number 7. Can you guys talk about where do these test sites exist? Is it public land? Is it private land? What is that relationship like? And what is the relationship with somewhat related, because we think of this migration of people from urban environments to the desert for this lifestyle where they can shape the communities that they live in. And so I guess, yeah, I was just wondering if you could expand on the public-private land relationship, thinking about relationships with indigenous communities and the leave no trace sort of elements as well.
I mean, that's something that we're constantly reshaping now. At the beginning, Andrea was always very like conscious of leaving everything the way that it was found, but it didn't mean that like giant holes didn't get dug, and it didn't mean that like giant pools didn't get temporarily sited in the middle of the desert. But she tried to like kind of like give people the freedom that at the time felt right. And some of those projects, like, I don't think we would do again today. I think it would be different. And that's part of why Elena and I think we gravitate more towards smaller gestures. And in the past, everything was always very publicly accessible. And it was either on some of Andrea's private land or Andy's private land, or it was on BLM land, which maybe we would do with or without permission, depending on how temporary that was going to be. And then I know most people here probably know what BLM land, but for anybody who doesn't know what BLM land is, Bureau of Land Management land, and public land, and like, you really kind of like, if you do something big that's going to be there for like more than a day, you really do have to like ask permission. We didn't always ask permission. I think we do think about that differently now too. But I mean, we try to keep a very minimal footprint. But I think that even that minimal footprint is going to be smaller and smaller as time goes on.
I think one of the things that was really exciting to hear in your talk in thinking about that footprint, while you say that it's smaller and smaller, I think you'll actually have exponential longevity in that the really exciting news about the Copper Mesa fire outpost and just the place that you hold in the community and swap meet that I've experienced personally. I think those community engagements and that programming might let you actually have that longer term engagement with a smaller, like actual like public life footprint or something like that. Are there any questions in the audience? Yes, in the far back.
I asked if that's okay for the question.
Sure.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this talk. I have several desert test sites in the very early years. And I really appreciate your openness and honesty about where you're at now, and also your commitment to revisiting those mission statement tenets and being responsive to changes. So I have a two-part question. The first part is about whether or not there have been works in the past, or you can imagine, in light of the kind of close of your talk, about the way that Joshua Tree is kind of a cultural capital. Now it has a lot more cultural capital and literal capital. And of course, part of that is because of the presence of Vanesa Zendejas and high desert test sites, which you said. And so I'm curious if there's been work in the past, or you can imagine there being more projects that deal with that kind of very complicated connection between art and gentrification. I don't mean this as a judgmental question. It's more in my mind, I was thinking through the potential of that as a subject matter. I think the challenge with that is that those projects might not be very fun. Then the second question is really specific, and I recently went to Desert X for the first time. And that, as a cultural event, is pretty unapologetic about staging works that are monumental in scale. And so I'm curious about how High Desert Test Site sort of thinks of itself or positions itself now relative to this newer biennial that has also kind of taken on a life of its own.
I mean, one thing that we're doing, which we haven't really been public about, but it's not a secret, is this next biennial event that we're going to have in the spring of 2022 is going to be our last biennial event. So we have been talking over the last few years about how we feel like the model is kind of not as useful right now as it was before, and it doesn't do what it did before. And that it's not sensitive enough to the sort of layers that need to be sort of addressed about the community, and specifically about Joshua Tree. And then with Andrea's sort of, and like HDTS's kind of own role in the sort of, you know, cultural capitalization of that area, what we are going to try to do both at AC West and with HDTS programming in the future is make it more residency-based, more equitable, create more educational public programming that is for the local community. And that can take the form of real, like, that area still does lack a lot of like normal arts resources. I mean, even if we begin to teach, for instance, like ceramics workshops and weaving workshops at AC West, and that's something that you can't do otherwise there. And that for us is this really simple thing that we can do that can contribute back to the community in a way that is meaningful. And then for HDTS, our vision really is rooted in like public programming for that community. And it's going to take shape in things like we have this new project we're working on called the Desert Research Library. And that is a sort of rotating library and calling like accumulating library project where we invite 10 different community members to sort of build a library collection. And that library collection will be about the things then it will reflect our community. And then that can serve as a resource also for the community and sort of an inspirational sort of like art production space also for the community. So we're definitely we've been rethinking programming a lot over the last couple of years and are really going to change a lot.
Yeah, I think also maybe our own project in response to the gentrification would be thinking about community, but that's just like community, like what is community, who is there? And so we've really been feeling like it's not just about creating an opportunity, but about really reaching out and like finding out who's there. It's not just one mono community or type of person that represents the local, but it's many different projects, and that involves us literally going out and meeting people one-on-one, talking to them and having all of these conversations together. And hopefully like publicly we've talked about having panel discussions about this very topic. So it could be a future project.
So I have one question that came in from online, and I think it's really relevant just thinking about the rural image. You talked about a lot of the issues of the urban environments moving to the desert. And so it's a harsh landscape where there's a lot of environmental issues and concerns. Ellen who's watching online, thank you, Ellen, asked, how do you imagine climate change might impact the arts and civilian communities in and around Joshua Tree? Might sink or swim apply to this area as a whole? Anything about the greater community?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about the specific sort of like circumstances that we're in, I mean, water is at the top.
Sure.
And it's something that it's one of the things that we want to like include more and to understand more. I mean, for us specifically, I mean, water's not going to last there. So there is this like funny idea that all of these people from LA or New York have moved out to Joshua Tree now, and like it's getting hotter. There's going to be less water. Like some people predict that that area is really only sustainable for about another 100 years. Like, what is this move like really for? It's like the population has exploded for 100 years and then it's gonna have to be gone. And it's for sure something that we think about.
We just had we kind of have this program at our swap meet spot of like kind of more casual pop-up artist projects by local artists, and our friend Tenants just did a 3-week residency of her tarot-based project called Eco Tarot, and it's this very provocative, I think, really powerful project that uses tarot to prompt people to think about climate change and their climate future, and like on the big scale, but also on the personal scale. And it opened up conversation with the small meet community in a way that I felt really proud of and really excited about. That tarot is this medium that draws in people who might not necessarily think about climate change all the time, as well as people who do, a very diverse population. And she had a lot of conversations, just get people to talk about water and fire and what it means to live in the desert.
It's really interesting thinking in the desert, as was mentioned earlier, and I think it probably at times unfortunately gets confused with sites or things of that nature. Just thinking about the water and the sort of flash in the pan experience of these monumental waves of art and people coming to the desert, with Palm Bay Beach and the Salton Sea, which is just, you know, you're kind of your neighbor in many ways, and as a community that was extravagant community that was literally now ruins on the shores of a livable sea that was created by the folly of people trying to redirect Colorado. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I think we've tried to do more with our publications is to address these things like for our community that maybe isn't always thinking about it when they're experiencing art. We try to, through these publications that we have that kind of like delve deeper into issues in the community and issues in the region, like make sure that they're still within their own support.
Yeah, that's just scout book series, which have 4 or 5 volumes written by different writers who resided in the area.
And also this desert destination guide where we a large catalog of like the many different including consultancy and sort of sharing with people who may not know like what the story is.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. Just reading the history of Uber Data, trying to learn like the real history of consultancy and why it's there.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating story. I think we have time for one very last question. I know there's a question down in the front, gentleman in the vest. Bill.
Thanks, Chris. You know, the change that you're undergoing is part of a generational change that's occurring around or site-specific exhibition works and so forth. That extends from places in Switzerland to Center for Land Use Interpretation of Window. All these things are changing all the time. Are you looking at models elsewhere around the world? Are you thinking about how this is moving to what you're doing? Do you have any models for your behavior? Or are people coming to you and asking you, well, how are you going to have this change?
For the sake of the online audience, I'm just going to encapsulate that really briefly. The question was thinking about the generational shift and how the generational shift that's happening behind the test sites. The question was specifically if you're looking at other examples from around the globe, and vice versa, if other organizations or groups of artists are coming to you and asking for advice there.
Right now, we're mostly having open dialogue with a lot of our sort of organizations in our field. There's several organizations in LA that we have ongoing conversations with. There's the Feminist Center for Creative Work. There's Clock Shop. There's LAND, the Los Angeles Nomadic Art Division. And those are some of the ones in California that we have an ongoing dialogue with. I don't know if we have like a model that we're looking at. We have also like older models that we look to. For AZ West, we look at Shinati. We look at the Judd Foundation. We look at a lot of these other sort of regional, you know, sort of all-encompassing organizations. And right now we're trying to just kind of like notice the things that we think make sense for us and maybe some of the things that don't, because it's also very like different what land might do in LA or what's right for them and versus us out in the desert. And then we also do try to have, you know, like ongoing dialogue with like our local organizations like the Monoculture Desert Land Trust. And
yeah, I think it's something that is ongoing, that we are eager to hear and learn of more models. So we can talk to you about that later.
but it does feel like we're in like a sort of gestation period still. Like we're still trying to like listen a lot. And Elena and I are still also new at running this. And so we're trying to sort of incorporate all of this into like how we can restructure the organization, but also how we can restructure the mission.
And I think we're also looking at individual artists' projects too. Sometimes Andrea has been a great resource, I think, as an artist. I mean, we're artists too, but she has a wider network and more experience, and she grows artists at us all the time. So with that, we try to squeeze in time to research. Yeah.
Well, I want to be mindful of everybody's time, and I want to thank Vanessa and Elena for coming on today. I'm personally really excited to see what comes out of this gestation period and see which artists are being thrown at you and do exciting things out of the desert. Again, congratulations on the Copper Mesa thing. I can't wait to that. Sounds really exciting. And thank you to our audience for coming in and hanging out today and for the fantastic questions. I'd like to remind you that you can check out the services in the field, Art in the High Desert from Campers Hotels AZ West. High Desert Test Sites, which is upstairs in our galleries right now and is on view until not November 6th, February 6th. And it sounds like the archive will be growing, so that's also very exciting. Look forward to revisiting this archive in the future. Thank you very much. And thanks to our online audience for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon.